Welcome to the Unlist. Today I'm going to repeat an exercise that I started back in episode 58. In that episode, we went back in time 100 years and saw what it was like to buy perfume 100 years ago. Now, being that video was last year, 2023, the 100 year ago timestamp was 1923. Now we are in 2024, so we are going to instead go back 50 years instead of 100 years. But since it's 24 and not 23, we can't go back to 1973. We have to go back to 1974. But 1 year difference does not really make. We're still smack dab in the middle of the 70s either way. Also, being as we're only going back 50 years and not 100 years, there will definitely be people who watch this video that were alive back then. So you are free to add to the conversation to confirm or deny anything I say. Granted, I wasn't alive back then. I can only base what I know off of what I research and what people tell me. And I can't expect everyone to tell me the truth either. So I could be passing along a lie. And if I do that, then I want to be politely notified of that. So without further ado, let's go back in time 50 years instead of 100 years. 50 years to 1974 and see what buying perfume was like back then. Whether you want to use your Wayback Machine like Professor Peabody, or you want to use a TARDIS like Doctor Who, or you want to hop in a DeLorean like Doc Brown, or if you're an H.G. Wells fan, that weird spinny disc time machine thing with the little levers, you want to go back in time with that. It's all good. However you want to get there is up to you, but regardless, we're going back to 1974, and we are seeing what it's like to buy perfume. Well, I personally feel like buying perfume in 1974 is a lot closer to 2024 than it would be to 1924. There was a lot of progress made within 50 years on the first, on the front side of it, then on the back side of it. So the amount of change we've experienced between 74 and now, buying perfume, not the style of perfume, not the composition of perfume, just buying it. The differences between buying it in 74 and now have been much less drastic than they were from 24 until 74. So we've seen more change then than we're currently seeing with the way perfumes are marketed and sold. We can blame a lot of that on the immediate post-war years. It was in the 50s and 60s that a lot of the conventions we still see now were established. So the 70s was in a well-worn groove by then. They weren't going to deviate or make drastic changes from what had been established immediately after World War II. The biggest things you will notice, though, is not only has perfume stopped being a wealth signifier, but it has also become much more of a sex symbol among people who wear it. So people who wore perfume in the 20s, for instance, wore it to showcase their wealth. It was very expensive, very hard to come by, okay? Most guys wore nothing because they didn't know of anything they could wear, and what few who did wear perfume had to make do with Jiki or Mitsoko if you're Charlie Chaplin, or they used some kind of custom aftershave or cologne they got from a barbershop or an apothecary if they lived in a major city, okay? The men's market was in its nascent years. It didn't even properly exist in the 20s. But by 1974, things were different. Perfume was very commonplace. It was getting marketed not as a Veblen good, not as a wealth signifier. It was marketed as a grooming accessory. Whether it was part of a shaving routine or it was part of a woman's makeup routine where you'd have the face powder and the lipstick scented the same way as the perfume, or it was part of a finishing touch on a ensemble you put together. You wore a certain suit from the brand. You wore a certain hat from the brand. You also wore the brand's cologne or perfume to complete the getup, as it were. And then, of course, perfume was also much more strongly marketed as a sexual attraction tool, which is what we still see now, right? With dude bros and their beast mode this and their club banger that, and Sigma male grind set make me want to throw up, but you get my point, right? That BS was really hammered into place in the 70s. Although back then they had a sense of humor, right? Nowadays, guys take themselves way too seriously with the whole alpha male thing, and I am peak performance. This is what peak performance looks like, whether you like it or not. This is what it is. Or I'm Giga Chad with my chin attached to my chin, looking like Jay Leno with 15 chins, but I'm Mega Giga Chad. Look at me go. I've got 5,000% testosterone flooding my system, and I'm going to have a heart attack at any moment, but I'm so, baby's arm holding an apple, whatever. So, paper tigers as they are, in my opinion. But back then, it was a little more comical. The stuff was meant to actually not be fully taken seriously. It was meant to be more on the side of levity. I mean, especially with the ads. High karate, watch out. The girls going to have to fight them off you. Or like sex appeal. Jovan sex appeal. Stuff like that. Macho. The bottle looks basically almost like a penis turned upside down, right? Macho by Fabergé. It was just a much less serious time with this stuff. And the guys bought the perfumes, and it was fun. It was supposed to be fun. You were supposed to enjoy it. You're not supposed to put it on and then get all angry that nobody complimented you. Oh, I wore this and nobody complimented me. I'm going to throw it away now, buy something else. Ugh. You put it on, you go out, have some beers after work, shoot some pool, maybe ask for a phone number, take someone back home, whatever, but it wasn't that serious, okay? People were busy having a good time. So the marketing of the day and the conventions of the day kind of reflect that good time feeling. And the women's fragrances were also very free-spirited. They were exploring their sexuality a little more intently in the 70s, The whole idea of the liberated woman who wore blue jeans and who wore a business suit, no longer stuck at home cooking, wearing the sundress. Now she could be independent, free-spirited, and wear something like Wood Hue by Fabergé or Charlie by Revlon. That was the general MO of the 70s with the perfume. Okay, so whole different vibe from the 1920s, trust me. The 20s was all about structure, rigidity. It was all about women being elegant and women being resplendent and perfectly feminine, and guys being structured and buttoned up and perfectly masculine and jaw out like this, and I've got my cane and my top hat and I look like I'm Rockefeller, right? That's the vibe. 70s wasn't really about that vibe. That wasn't the thing people wanted back then. They wanted to, live it up a little, and the perfumes reflected that. Now, the other big thing you'll notice, since fragrances were more about grooming and more about sexual expression, they were no longer status. They were no longer signifiers of wealth. They were also much more commonly available by 1974. Rather than just having specific boutiques to buy perfumes, or if you were lucky and lived in a major city, you had like a Macy's for the whole city or something. You now had chain department stores. You had the advent of indoor shopping malls by the 70s. They weren't everywhere. The 80s and the 90s, they'd be everywhere. The 70s, the indoor shopping malls were just becoming a thing, but there were enough of them around that the general public, if they wanted to take a trip, they could reach one. And then they could expand beyond the selection of the local town. Now, Europe didn't really have this experience. Europe still stayed a little more old-fashioned with the high streets and the high street storefronts and the little independent boutiques. They didn't really have the chains as much. So if you live in Europe, your experience may not be the same in the 70s. You didn't have the big indoor shopping malls with the water fountains and stuff, but at least in America, that sort of homogenized, franchised, duplicated kind of experience was what we had in the 70s. And the other big thing was Avon. Avon would be bigger in the 80s with makeup and cosmetics, but in terms of perfume, they had reached their peak by the 70s. So a lot of small towns that were still too far away from the shopping malls, still too far away from the big box department stores, if you didn't like what the general merchandiser had, you didn't like what the drugstore had, then you had the mother or the next door neighbor's wife or the sister or whoever peddling Avon door to door, usually on Saturday and Sunday when everyone was home because everybody worked during the week and had off on weekends back then. So yeah, there were entire towns that basically lived on Avon. You know, there were Avon towns and everybody wore Avon and people were excited about the catalogs and they were excited about the new gift sets coming out and the new this and the new that. You might not think so nowadays, but yeah, people were very excited in the same way they were excited about Tupperware and they were excited about, you know, rainbow vacuum cleaners and freaking Kirby's, and they were excited about all that stuff, that door-to-door stuff. People were into that back then. People actually would invite those folks into their houses. Come on in. Show me what you got. I want to see what you're selling. You know, it's Saturday. I'm off work. You know, throw me your sales pitch. I want to see what you got. Nowadays, that would never happen. We'd be like looking at you like this through a peephole, you know, because these days you might get burglarized if you let someone in your house that you don't know. But back then, a little bit different world, and Avon did exceedingly well. So you will find tons and tons and tons of Avon all over eBay, especially in the United States, because there were Avon ladies who had little storefronts. You know, they would be Avon ladies, but they would also be owners of the local nail salon, or their husband would own the hardware store, or their husband would own the hobby shop. So they would set up the Avon at the counter in those stores, underneath in the glass cases, whatever. Did really well for themselves. So Avon definitely made the rounds a lot more back then. And in general, my point being, in general, there was a much greater diaspora of options, low end and high end. And a lot of people, regardless of what walk of life you lived, whether you were a lawyer or a doctor, you know, or you were just an electrician, a carpenter, or you were someone who worked at a factory, worked at a cannery, worked at an automotive factory, it didn't matter. Whatever walk of life you lived, you had reasonable access to low cost, high quality perfume. That's a mind blower, because these days, low cost, high quality don't really go together in the same sentence, right? These days, you're actually much more likely to get high cost, low quality perfume. You know, buy a $150 bottle of some designer and it smells like ISOE Super and a little bit of lavender, and you're upset and you're on bass notes bitching about it. But in those days, you could go into a local Five and Dime. You could go into a drugstore. You could call up the Avon lady and spend only a few bucks, adjusted for inflation, a few bucks, and get a terrific bottle of perfume that lasts long enough and projects long enough. And the sandalwood smelled like sandalwood, and the lavender smelled like lavender, and the schnozberries tasted like schnozberries, okay? But you didn't pay an arm and a leg for it. And that's how it was back then, guys. It's really how it was. Things have come a very long way. Perfume was just about commoditized, just about. It was no longer an asset or a Veblen good. It was a commodity, just like a gallon of milk, okay? Just like a carton of eggs, just like a bar of soap, pack of toilet paper. Perfume was a commodity. Can you imagine, right? Can you imagine? But that's what it was. And guys wore the colognes to get the attention from the ladies, and the ladies wore the perfumes to make a statement about their individuality, and everyone paid pennies on the dollar to buy these fragrances, and it went to the discos, you know, and kissed and made out, smoked some pot, whatever, drove their Dodge Cordoba with the Corinthian leather, listening to the Fog Hat from the 8-track player with their tightest tight can be Angel Flight pants on, not giving a care in the world, having feather upon feather upon feather of hair, and it was the life of Riley for everyone. You know, Lottie freaking da. And that's what it was, you know? So, one thing we didn't have the pressure of trend. We didn't have the pressure of the internet, of the fast pace. That is one thing that we didn't have back then. So there were people in 1974 who were just discovering Aramis from the prior decade because a coworker walked into the office and you're like, hey man, that smells good. What is that? That's Aramis, my dude. Estee Lauder. Get yourself down to the local Bonton or whatever and get you a bottle. It's great stuff, man. I recommend. The ladies love it or whatever, you know, or your mother or your sister or, you know, your next door neighbor's girlfriend will be like, yeah, man, I got this new thing. It's called Charlie. It smells great. It's really good, you know, and that's how you learned about perfume. You had young women in their 20s buying Chanel No. 5, which bear in mind, Chanel No. 5 by 1974 was a 53-year-old perfume. Run that through your head one more time, slower. 53-year-old perfume, but young women were still buying it in droves. That is how glacial trends were back then in terms of fragrance. Not fashion, okay? Maybe not music, okay? But for fragrance, it was not weird for a young person to like something that came out a half century prior. Wasn't a big deal. And it was also not weird for fragrance to still be popular and still be on the market 10 years, 15 years later. It was not weird for a guy in the 70s to just discover Chanel Pour Monsieur, to just discover, well, Chanel for men back then, but you get it, right? It was not weird for a young guy fresh out of high school to pick up a bottle of Brut that came out a decade ago when he was only like 12 or something, right? Or 10. And he's 20 years old and he's just buying his first bottle of Brut. It wasn't weird, you know? And you also didn't have to worry about a fragrance coming out and then getting discontinued in 6 months. You didn't have to worry about Yves Saint Laurent coming out with La Nuit de l'Homme Bleu Electrique, right? And everyone goes crazy. Bleu Electrique is out. And then in 6 months, it's gone. At $400 on freaking eBay. 6 months. That didn't happen back then. Things did not go like this, okay? They didn't. You had time to breathe and relax and discover things at your own pace, okay? That is something we cannot take for granted now. Nowadays, every 6 months, every 4 months even, new releases, new flankers, discontinuations, faster, 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 more, 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 more. Blink and you will miss it, okay? The things that are popular today are gone tomorrow. Just like that, you know? Things that you thought would always be around are gone before you know it. It's not how it was back then. Granted, that also means that you had less new stuff to play with, you know? There weren't all these independent brands making limited releases. There wasn't really a niche market yet, okay? Not back then. So what you had was what you had. That is one downside to that. New things only came out every couple of years at most. But at very least, the stuff that was already out, you had plenty of time to discover. And you weren't necessarily worried about, well, if I buy this and I use this, when I go to buy it again, will it be there or will it be gone or will it be reformulated, right? There wasn't all this dread of things being altered or removed beyond recognition, okay? Things were just there, and that's it. Some ways, I think that's kind of better, you know? We can't leave well enough alone now, can we? No, definitely not. Definitely not. Always looking for the next best thing. Like a drug addict, always trying to get the next high. It's kind of the way things are now. So, A lot of that would be, well, frankly, as you know, would be because of the internet, would be because of the hyper fashion, the obsession with relevance, the obsession with being the new kid on the block that has the coolest toys. Every time you turn around, there's a new version of something, and the old version is long gone and being scalped on eBay or Mercari or wherever. That's the world we live in now. So that was going back in time 50 years ago and buying fragrance. If you were around back then and you want to tell me different, please do in the comment section. If I missed something, got something incorrect, I'd like to know. This has been the Unlist, and I hope you enjoyed it.